The pressurized cabin of a first-class flight is a world unto itself. It's a bubble of hushed tones, warm towels, and champagne that costs more than a monthly car payment. It's supposed to be a sanctuary at 30,000 feet, a place where the ugliness of the world below can't reach. But on a Sendair flight 715 from Los Angeles to New York, that bubble was about to burst. For one 17-year-old boy, the recycled air would soon become thick with accusation and prejudice. And for the crew who judged him by the color of his skin and the brand of his hoodie, they were about to learn a terrifying lesson. Sometimes, the quietest passenger holds all the power. The journey began, as most do, with the mundane choreography of boarding. First-class passengers on Flight 715 were a predictable mix of tailored suits, designer handbags, and the weary, entitled expressions of people who spent more time in the sky than on the ground. Into this polished environment walked Royce Maxwell. At 17, Royce was tall and lanky, with a thoughtful face and deep, observant eyes. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, but not in the spotlight. Today that skin was framed by a simple grey fleece hoodie, worn-in jeans, and a pair of scuffed but clean sneakers. His backpack was a standard black canvas affair, not the leather monogrammed carry-on common in this cabin. He was, by all appearances, utterly unremarkable, and in first class, that made him a target. The lead flight attendant, a woman named Karen Miller, watched him from her post near the galley. Karen had been flying for 25 years. Her smile was professionally lacquered, but her eyes performed a constant, swift calculus of status. She saw Royce and her internal ledger came up short. Wrong cabin, her expression seemed to say. "Can I help you find your seat, sir?" she asked, her voice dripping with a saccharine condescension. She placed a subtle emphasis on the word "sir," as if it were a costume he was trying on. Royce glanced at his boarding pass. "Yes, I'm in 2A. Karen's smile tightened. "Of course you are. Right this way." She gestured towards the window seat in the second row, her movements clipped and efficient. Royce settled in, pulling out a well-worn paperback novel and a set of simple, wired earbuds. He was used to this. He was the son of Lawrence Maxwell, the founder and CEO of Ethelred Capital Group, a private equity behemoth whose portfolio included everything from tech startups to, ironically, Ascend Air's parent company, Global Skyways Holdings. But Royce rarely advertised this fact. He preferred to navigate the world on his own terms, to see it without the distorting filter of his father's wealth. Flights like these were a social experiment, a stark reminder of how quickly people judged a book by its cover. As the other passengers settled, Karen's junior partner, a nervous, eager-to-please flight attendant named Brenda Walsh, came by to offer pre-departure beverages. She served the man in 2B, a slick-looking man in his 40s with a loud voice and an expensive watch, a glass of champagne with a flourish. When she got to Royce, her smile faltered. "Anything for you?" she asked, her tone hesitant, as if she expected him to ask for something difficult. "Just a water, please." "No ice," Royce said, not looking up from his book. Brenda scurried away, returning with the water. The contrast in service was not lost on Royce, but he said nothing. He simply wanted to get to New York to visit his grandmother. He put his earbuds in, turned on a lo-fi playlist, and closed his eyes, hoping to disappear for the next 5 hours. Across the aisle, the man in 2B, whose name was Chad Peterson, was making a show of arranging his belongings. He was a VP of sales for some mid-level software company, and he played the part with gusto, speaking loudly into his phone about synergizing deliverables until the very last second before the cabin door was closed. He conspicuously placed a pair of brand-new silver Bose 700 noise-cancelling headphones on the small console between his seat and the aisle. Karen Miller passed by, pausing to offer Peterson another glass of champagne. "Mr. Peterson, so good to have you back with us," she said, her voice warm and genuine. She had recognized him from previous flights. He was a somebody. "Always a pleasure, Karen," he boomed, giving her a familiar smile. His eyes flickered over to Royce, a brief, dismissive glance that took in the hoodie and the cheap earbuds. He scoffed under his breath and turned back to his screen. The plane took off, a smooth, powerful ascent into the California sky. Below, the sprawling lights of Los Angeles faded into a glittering carpet. Inside the climate-controlled tube, a quiet drama was already taking shape. The lines had been drawn, the judgments made. All it needed was a spark to ignite the fire. An hour into the flight, the cabin was settled into a comfortable rhythm. The clink of cutlery from the meal service had subsided. The lights were dimmed, and most passengers were either sleeping or lost in their screens. Royce was engrossed in his book, the soft, instrumental music from his earbuds, a pleasant barrier against the drone of the engines. The calm was shattered by Chad Peterson's voice, sharp and accusatory. Excuse me, flight attendant." Karen Miller was there in an instant, her face a mask of concern. "Yes, Mr. Peterson? Is everything all right?" "No, it's not all right," he said, his voice rising in volume, ensuring everyone in the front cabin could hear. "My headphones, my Bose headphones, they're gone." He was patting down his seat, the console, the pocket in front of him, with exaggerated, frantic motions. "They were right here on the console before I went to the lavatory 10 minutes ago. Now they're gone." Karen's professional demeanor shifted into one of high alert. "Are you certain, sir? Perhaps they slipped down the side of your seat." "I'm not an idiot, Karen," Peterson snapped. "I've looked everywhere. They were worth over $400. Someone took them." His eyes, deliberately and immediately, darted across the aisle and landed on Royce. It wasn't a subtle glance. It was a pointed, unwavering stare. Every head in the cabin slowly turned to follow his gaze. Royce felt the weight of their eyes like a physical pressure. He slowly pulled out his earbuds, the sudden silence of the cabin roaring in his ears. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm. Karen Miller walked over and stood in the aisle next to Royce's seat, her arms crossed. Her earlier condescension had now curdled into open suspicion. "Sir," she began, her voice cold and official, "the gentleman across the aisle is missing a pair of expensive headphones. They disappeared while he was away from his seat. You were sitting right here the entire time." The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It wasn't a question, it was an indictment. Royce's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Okay. And?" Peterson chimed in from his seat, his voice laced with venom. "You're the only one who didn't get up. I saw you, just sitting there with your hood up." It was a lie. Royce's hood was down, but the image was planted. The quiet, hooded black kid in a sea of wealthy white faces. The narrative wrote itself. "I was reading," Royce said, holding up his paperback. "I didn't see anything." "Or you saw an opportunity," Peterson shot back. Brenda Walsh had now joined Karen, standing behind her like a nervous shadow. She wrung her hands, her eyes flitting between her superior, the angry passenger, and the accused teenager. "Sir," Karen said to Royce, her voice taking on the unyielding tone of someone who had already reached a verdict. "We need to resolve this. Would you mind if we took a look in your backpack?" Royce felt a surge of indignation. It was happening again. The assumptions, the instant judgment. He had two choices: create a scene and demand his rights, or comply and prove his innocence, hoping the humiliation would be brief. He chose the latter. believing in the simple power of the truth. "Be my guest," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He reached down, pulled his backpack from under the seat in front of him, and placed it on his lap. "There's nothing in there but a book, a sweatshirt, and a laptop." He unzipped the main compartment. Karen leaned over, her expression one of grim determination. Peterson craned his neck, a smug look on his face, certain of his victory. The other passengers were now openly staring, some even pulling out their phones, their screens glowing in the dim cabin light. They were no longer passengers on a flight. They were the audience at a public shaming. Karen began to rifle through his belongings, her touch rough and invasive. She pulled out his spare sweatshirt, a history textbook, his laptop charger. No headphones. She checked the side pockets, the front pouch. Nothing but a pen, a charging cable for his phone, and a pack of gum. Her face, for a moment, registered a flicker of disappointment. "See? Nothing," Royce said, the edge in his voice now unmistakable. But Peterson wasn't giving up. He probably stashed them on him. "Check his pockets. That big hoodie has a lot of places to hide things." The demand was outrageous, a complete violation. Royce looked at Karen, expecting her to draw a line, to say this had gone too far. Instead, she straightened up, her jaw set. "Sir, if you want this to be over with quickly, I suggest you cooperate." The fire in Royce's stomach turned to ice. They were actually going to do this. They were going to physically search him, here, in the middle of a first-class cabin, in front of a dozen strangers, based on nothing more than the word of an angry man and the color of his skin. "This is ridiculous," Royce said, his voice low. "What's ridiculous?" Karen countered, her voice rising. "Is theft on an airplane. It's a federal offense. We can have the captain call ahead, have authorities meet us at the gate, or you can just stand up, empty your pockets, and we can all move on with our flight." It was a threat wrapped in a choice, a coerced surrender. The world had shrunk to the space of his seat, the accusing eyes of the crew, and the silent judgment of the passengers. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that this was about to get much, much worse. The air in the cabin was thick with tension. The low hum of the engines seemed to amplify the silence that had fallen over the first-class section. Royce looked from Karen's resolute face to Brenda's nervous one, and then to the other passengers. No one spoke up for him. They were either complicit in their silence or too afraid to intervene. They were spectators. "Fine," Royce said, his voice barely a whisper. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up in the narrow space, his 6'2" frame making the aisle feel even more claustrophobic. "The captain needs to be made aware," Karen said to Brenda, not taking her eyes off Royce. It was a power play, a way to formalize the proceeding and add another layer of authority and intimidation. Brenda nodded meekly and disappeared towards the cockpit. A minute later, she returned, followed by Captain Robert Davies. The captain was a man in his late 50s with a neat, graying moustache and an air of weary command. He looked at the scene, the standing teenager, the accusatory passenger, the grim-faced flight attendant, and sighed internally. It was a customer service issue, a messy one, and he wanted it resolved with minimal paperwork. "What's the situation here, Karen?" he asked, his voice a low baritone meant to project control. "Mr. Peterson in 2B reported his noise-cancelling headphones stolen," Karen explained crisply. "The passenger in 2A was the only person in the immediate vicinity who did not leave his seat. We've searched his bag with his permission and found nothing. The reporting passenger believes the item may be on his person." Captain Davies looked at Royce. It was a cursory, evaluative glance. He saw a kid in a hoodie. He saw a first-class cabin. He saw an equation That, in his experience, often resulted in trouble. His primary duty was to his crew and the smooth operation of his flight. De-escalation was key, and the path of least resistance was to support his lead attendant. "Son," the captain said, his tone paternalistic but firm, "we don't want any trouble here. Why don't you just turn out your pockets so we can put this matter to rest?" Royce felt a profound sense of isolation. Even the captain, the ultimate authority on the plane, had already sided with them. To resist now would be to confirm their suspicions, to be labeled as difficult or aggressive. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled the contents from his jeans pockets, his phone, a worn leather wallet, and a single key. He placed them on his seat. "There," he said. Peterson scoffed. "The hoodie. It's in the hoodie pocket." Royce looked down at the large kangaroo pocket on the front of his fleece. With a deep breath, he reached in and turned it inside out. It was empty. A collective, faint sigh of disappointment seemed to ripple through the cabin. The show was not yielding the dramatic climax they had anticipated. Karen Miller, however, was not finished. Her credibility was on the line. "We need to be thorough," she said. Her eyes narrowed. She took a step forward. "Sir, I need you to lift your arms." It was no longer a request. It was an order. Royce stared at her, his mind racing. He was being treated like a criminal. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to shout, to protest this gross violation. But he thought of his father's words, a lesson instilled in him from a young age. In a moment of crisis, never let them see you lose your composure. Anger is a weapon they will use against you. Clarity is a shield they can never penetrate. He slowly raised his arms. Karen, with a grim sense of duty, began to pat down the sides of his torso and the outside of his legs. It was a clumsy, unprofessional search, but the humiliation was expert level. It was a public branding, a declaration that he was untrustworthy, that he did not belong. He could feel the phone cameras on him, recording his debasement for future retweets and shares. She found nothing. Of course, she found nothing. She stepped back, her face a mixture of frustration and confusion. The narrative she had constructed in her head had crumbled. There was no stolen item, no satisfying gotcha moment. There was just a teenager she had publicly humiliated for no reason. And then, as if on cue, came the twist. Chad Peterson let out a small, theatrical gasp. "Oh, my God," he said, his voice suddenly sheepish. He was rummaging in his own laptop bag, which had been at his feet the entire time. He pulled out the sleek, silver Bose 700s. "Well, what do you know? They must have been in my side pocket the whole time. I never even thought to look there. Silly me." The apology was so flimsy, so transparently false, it was an insult in itself. He didn't make eye contact with Royce. He directed his performance to Karen and the captain. "So sorry for the misunderstanding," he said with a weak chuckle. "My mistake. All this travel, you know. My head gets scrambled." The tension in the cabin didn't dissipate. It transformed into a thick, awkward embarrassment. The accusers were now left standing in the aisle, their certainty exposed as baseless prejudice. Captain Davies cleared his throat. "Well then, glad we could resolve that." He gave Royce a curt nod. "Our apologies for the disturbance, young man." Karen Miller's apology was even worse. "Sorry for the mix-up," she mumbled, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Royce's shoulder. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. She and Brenda quickly retreated to the galley. The captain returned to the cockpit. The show was over. Royce sank back into his seat, his body trembling with a quiet, controlled rage. He could feel the other passengers' gazes on him now, a mixture of pity and discomfort. They put their phones away, suddenly ashamed to have been part of it. The man who had been filming across the aisle quietly deleted the video. The humiliation was complete. But as the plane continued its journey through the dark sky, Royce reached for his phone. He didn't text a friend or a family member to vent. He opened a secure messaging app and typed a single, cryptic message to a contact labeled DC. Incident on AA 7 Wafimv. Code red. Need full executive reception at JFK Gate B28. No authorities. Just us. He hit send. The message was delivered instantly. A moment later, 2 blue check marks appeared. The message had been read. The crew of Ascend Air Flight 715 thought the incident was over. They had no idea it was just beginning. The karma that was coming for them wasn't going to be a gentle correction. It was going to be a corporate tsunami. For the remaining 3 hours of the flight, a fragile and uncomfortable peace settled over the first-class cabin. Karen and Brenda avoided aisle 2 entirely, sending another flight attendant to cater to the passengers there. Chad Peterson put on his newly discovered headphones and pretended to be asleep, hiding from the consequences of his actions. The other passengers kept to themselves, wrapped in a collective blanket of awkwardness. Royce didn't read his book. He couldn't focus. He stared out the window at the dark, cloud-strewn expanse, his mind replaying the events in a painful loop. The suspicion in Karen's eyes, the captain's dismissive tone, the feeling of her hands patting him down, the shame, the anger. It wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, but it was the most public, the most visceral. He felt a cold resolve solidifying within him. This wasn't just about a stolen headphone that wasn't stolen. It was about the abuse of authority, the casual bigotry that festered in the cracks of polite society. The first signs of dawn were breaking over the horizon as the plane began its descent into New York City. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their imminent arrival at John F. Kennedy International Airport. He thanked them for flying Ascend Air. The irony was not lost on Royce. As the plane taxied to Gate B28, the usual flurry of activity began. Seatbelts were unbuckled, bags were pulled from overhead bins, and people crowded the aisle, eager to deplane. Royce, however, remained seated. He watched Peterson scurry out of his seat and disappear down the jet bridge without a backward glance. He watched the other passengers leave, their eyes studiously avoiding his. Karen and Brenda stood at the front of the plane, forcing their professional smiles as they bid farewell. When the cabin was nearly empty, Karen noticed Royce was still in his seat. "Sir, we've arrived. You're free to deplane," she said, her voice strained. "I'm waiting for someone," Royce replied calmly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since the incident. There was no anger in his gaze, just a profound, unnerving stillness. It made her skin crawl. She exchanged a nervous look with Brenda and shrugged, turning her attention back to her post-flight duties. Finally, when every other passenger was gone, Royce stood up, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and walked slowly towards the open door. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, he was met not with the usual bustle of an airport terminal, but with a silent, waiting phalanx of people. There were 4 of them. 3 men and 1 woman, all dressed in immaculate dark suits. They stood with the quiet, imposing stillness of Secret Service agents. At their front stood a man in his 50s, with sharp, intelligent features and silver-streaked hair. This was David Chen, the chief operating officer of Ethelred Capital Group and his father's most trusted advisor. And standing next to him, his face a mask of cold fury, was Lawrence Maxwell. Lawrence was not a physically imposing man, but he possessed an aura of such intense power and authority that he seemed to command the very air around him. He was a ghost in the corporate world, rarely photographed, never interviewed. but his name was whispered with a mixture of fear and awe in boardrooms across the globe. Captain Davies was the first to emerge from the cockpit to hand off the flight manifest. He saw the assembly of suits and stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes widened in disbelief. He had only seen the CEO in a grainy photo on the company's internal website, but there was no mistaking him. It was Lawrence Maxwell. Karen and Brenda, tidying up the galley, heard the silence and poked their heads out. Karen's smile froze on her face. Her blood ran cold. She saw the most powerful man in the entire aviation industry standing 10 feet away from her. And then she saw him place a protective hand on the shoulder of the boy she had just humiliated. In that instant, the entire universe reconfigured itself. The insignificant kid in the hoodie was not an outsider who had slipped through the cracks. He was the heir to the entire kingdom. He was Royce Maxwell. Lawrence's eyes, as cold and grey as a winter storm, swept over the crew. They landed on Captain Davies, then Karen, then Brenda. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The chilling quiet of his anger was more terrifying than any shout. "Captain Davies," Lawrence said, his voice low and lethally precise. David Chen stepped forward and handed the captain a business card. "I am Lawrence Maxwell. This is my son." Captain Davies looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His face went pale, a slick sheen of sweat instantly appearing on his brow. Mr. Maxwell, sir, I had no idea." "That," Lawrence replied, his voice dropping another degree, "is precisely the problem. You had no idea, yet you and your crew appointed yourselves judge, jury, and executioner over a child on your aircraft. My child." He took a step forward, and the crew instinctively took a step back. "My son informed me of an incident on this flight," Lawrence continued, "a false accusation of theft, a public search, a gross abuse of authority. Tell me, Captain, is this the standard of service now offered by Ascend Air?" Karen Miller found her voice, though it was a weak, trembling thing. "Sir, it was a misunderstanding. The other passenger, he was mistaken. We apologized." Lawrence's gaze snapped to her. It was like being pinned by a laser. "An apology? You think an apology erases the humiliation you inflicted? You think a mumbled sorry is sufficient restitution for treating my son like a common criminal in front of a plane full of people?" He turned to David Chen. "David, their names. Karen Miller, lead flight attendant. Brenda Walsh, flight attendant. Captain Robert Davies," Chen recited from a tablet that had seemingly appeared in his hand. "All service records and complaint histories are being pulled as we speak." Lawrence Maxwell looked back at the three of them. The faint, practiced smile was long gone from Karen's face, replaced by a mask of pure terror. Brenda was openly crying. Captain Davies looked like he was about to be physically ill. "As of this moment," Lawrence announced, his voice echoing in the confined space of the jet bridge, "all three of you are suspended from duty, pending a full investigation. Your company credentials and airport access badges will be surrendered now." One of the men in suits stepped forward, holding an open pouch. He didn't speak. He just waited. The hard, cold reality slammed into them. This wasn't a reprimand. This was an exorcism. The ground had opened up beneath their feet, and they were falling. And they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that they had not yet hit the bottom. The jet bridge at Gate B-28 became a silent, sterile chamber of judgment. For the three crew members, it felt like the air had been sucked out, replaced by the crushing weight of their careers, imploding in real time. Captain Davies, fumbling with trembling hands, unclipped the ID badge from his pilot's uniform. The plastic card, which for 30 years had been a symbol of his authority and expertise, now felt like a shackle. He dropped it into the waiting pouch held by the stone-faced man in the suit. His career, his pride, his very identity as a captain, all gone in that single, ignominious motion. Karen Miller was next. The confident, authoritative woman who had commanded the cabin just hours before had vanished. In her place was a shaking, terrified, middle-aged woman on the verge of collapse. "Please, Mr. Maxwell," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I have a mortgage. I've given my life to this airline." Lawrence Maxwell's expression remained unchanged, a granite cliff unmoved by her desperate plea. "You gave your life to this airline," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "And in return, you were entrusted with its reputation, with the safety and dignity of its passengers. You betrayed that trust. You used the uniform this company gave you as a weapon to bully a teenager because you didn't like his clothes. Your mortgage is not my concern. The culture of my company is." She surrendered her badge, her hand shaking so violently that it clattered against the other IDs in the pouch. Brenda Walsh, through a veil of tears, simply handed hers over without a word. She was young, her career barely started, and she knew it was already over. She had followed a bad leader, and now she was paying the price. David Chen spoke into a discreet communications device on his wrist. "Security has been notified. They are to be escorted from the premises immediately. They are not to access any company property. Their lockers will be cleared and the contents shipped to their homes." It was a cold, ruthlessly efficient dismantling of their professional lives. Just as the crew was about to be led away, the final piece of the puzzle emerged from the jet bridge. Chad Peterson. He had been loitering in the terminal, perhaps morbidly curious about the hold-up. He saw the scene, the men in suits, the distraught crew, and the teenager standing next to a man who radiated terrifying power, and he immediately understood he had made a catastrophic error. He tried to turn, to blend into the stream of travelers, but it was too late. "Mr. Peterson!" Lawrence Maxwell's voice cut through the air, stopping him in his tracks. Peterson turned slowly, a sickly, forced smile plastered on his face. "Yes? Do I know you?" David Chen stepped forward, holding his tablet. "Chad Peterson, Vice President of Regional Sales for Syntech Solutions. Your company, Mr. Peterson, is currently in the 3rd round of negotiations to become a primary software vendor for 3 subsidiaries of the Ethelred Capital Group, a contract valued at approximately $8 million annually." The color drained from Peterson's face. The name Ethelred Capital Group hit him like a physical blow. He connected the dots with blinding, horrifying speed. "Furthermore," Chen continued, his tone clinical, "our legal team, represented here by Ms. Albright," he gestured to the woman in the suit, "has reviewed the passenger footage of the incident, which another first-class passenger has already forwarded to our corporate office. Your actions constitute slander and defamation, and the filing of a false report to the flight captain. We will be pursuing a civil suit for damages. The full force of my firm's legal resources will be brought to bear." Ms. Albright, the lawyer, stepped forward and handed Peterson a crisp envelope. "You've been served, Mr. Peterson. I'd advise you to retain counsel. A copy of this is also being sent to your CEO at Syntech, Mr. Gerald Finney. I believe Mr. Maxwell serves on the advisory board of the venture capital firm that holds a majority stake in your company." It was a perfectly executed corporate decapitation. In the span of 90 seconds, Lawrence Maxwell and his team had not only threatened Peterson's career and personal finances, but had also drawn a direct line to his own CEO, ensuring maximum professional devastation. Peterson looked at Royce, then at Lawrence. The smug arrogance was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. "It was a mistake, an honest mistake. I apologized." "You didn't apologize to my son," Lawrence said, his voice flat. "You offered a flippant excuse to the crew to save your own skin. You saw a black kid in first class and you saw a target. You saw an easy scapegoat. You were wrong." He turned his back on Peterson, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "David, ensure the initial complaint in the lawsuit is filed before lunch, and cancel the Syntec negotiations, permanently. I want a press release issued to all major financial news outlets by market open tomorrow, stating that Ethelred and its subsidiaries have severed all current and future ties with Syntec Solutions due to a fundamental misalignment of corporate values and ethics." With that, Lawrence Maxwell put his arm around his son's shoulders and guided him towards the terminal, leaving his team to manage the wreckage. The crew was led away by airport security, their faces pale with shock. Chad Peterson stood frozen in place, clutching the lawsuit summons, the architect of his own ruin. The immediate fallout was swift and brutal, but it was only the beginning. The deeper karma, the methodical and systemic consequences of their actions, was yet to come. And it would be far, far worse than a simple firing. In the sterile, glass-walled headquarters of Ethelred Capital Group in Manhattan, the aftermath of Flight 715 was not treated as a mere customer service complaint. It was treated as a systemic failure, a cancer that had to be carved out with surgical precision. Lawrence Maxwell was not a man who believed in half measures. His response was designed not just to punish, but to serve as a permanent, terrifying lesson to every employee in his vast corporate empire. The fate of Karen Miller. Karen's suspension quickly became a termination for gross misconduct. The internal investigation, led by David Chen's office, was mercilessly thorough. They didn't just focus on the incident with Royce, they unearthed a pattern. Using keyword data mining on years of post-flight reports and customer feedback emails, they flagged a dozen other complaints filed against her. Complaints from minority passengers, from non-native English speakers, from people in economy class who had been treated with disdain. Each complaint, on its own, had been dismissed by middle management as a one-off or an unsubstantiated claim. But compiled together, they painted a damning portrait of a woman who routinely abused her authority based on prejudice. She was fired without severance. But the true blow came next. Ethelred's legal team compiled the dossier and formally submitted it to the Federal Aviation Administration, along with a high-resolution copy of the video from the flight, which they had obtained from the passenger. They petitioned the FAA to review her flight attendant certification, citing a pattern of behavior that compromised passenger safety and dignity, arguing that her discriminatory conduct created a hostile environment that could escalate into a safety issue. 6 months later, after a lengthy review, the FAA agreed. Karen Miller's license was suspended indefinitely. She was blacklisted. Every time she applied for a job at another airline, even a budget carrier, her file would be flagged. The name Karen Miller became synonymous with liability. She tried to sue for wrongful termination, but Ethelred's army of lawyers buried her in motions and discovery requests until her savings ran out, and she was forced to drop the suit. The woman who had built her identity around her seniority and uniform was now unemployable in the only industry she had ever known. She ended up taking a job as a cashier at a suburban big-box store. The crisp blue of her new work vest, a constant, bitter reminder of the Ascend Air uniform she had lost forever. The path of Brenda Walsh. Brenda's situation was handled differently. During her investigative interview, she broke down completely. Sobbing, she confessed that she had felt uncomfortable from the beginning, that she knew Karen's targeting of Royce was wrong, but she was new, intimidated, and terrified of being disciplined by her senior officer. She provided a detailed, corroborating statement about Karen's long-standing biases, mentioning other incidents she had witnessed. Lawrence Maxwell reviewed her file and her testimony. He saw a follower, not a leader. A coward, but perhaps not a lost cause. She was still fired from Ascend Air. Her failure to intervene was a fireable offense in itself. There had to be accountability. However, she was not blacklisted. As part of her separation agreement, a unique clause was added. If she completed 500 hours of volunteer work with a non-profit dedicated to fighting racial injustice, like the NAACP or the Innocence Project, and underwent a rigorous anti-bias and conflict resolution training program at Ethelred's expense, the gross misconduct mark on her permanent record would be amended to voluntary resignation. It was a chance at redemption. Brenda took it. A year later, she was working for a small regional airline. She was quieter, more thoughtful, and quick to speak up if she saw any passenger being treated unfairly. The trauma of Flight 715 had become the defining lesson of her life. The reckoning of Captain Robert Davies. Captain Davies's fate was a study in corporate humiliation. He was a veteran pilot with a spotless flight record. He argued that he had followed procedure, backing his crew in a passenger dispute. Lawrence Maxwell's response was cutting. "Your procedure," he said during the final review board, "is to de-escalate, to protect all passengers, not to enable the prejudice of your crew. Your failure was not of procedure, but of character. You took the easy path, and in doing so, you became complicit." He wasn't fired. Firing a pilot with his experience was difficult and costly. Instead, he was made into an example. He was formally stripped of his captain rank, a public demotion that sent shockwaves through the pilot community. He was reassigned as a first officer, forced to sit in the right-hand seat and take orders from pilots who were once his juniors. He was also required to fly with a supervising captain for a full year and lead quarterly anti-bias and de-escalation training seminars for new pilots, where he was forced to use the recording of the Flight 715 incident and his own failure as the primary case study. For a man whose entire identity was built on his four-stripe epaulets and the title of captain, the punishment was a fate worse than termination. It was a daily, public reminder of his greatest failure, the complete annihilation of Chad Peterson. For Chad Peterson, the karma was not just hard, it was apocalyptic. As promised, the press release from Ethelred Capital Group hit the wires at 8:30 a.m. the next morning. It was a bombshell. Ethelred was not just a potential client for Syntec, it was a bellwether. When Ethelred blacklisted a company for ethical failures, the rest of Wall Street paid attention. By noon, Syntec's stock had plummeted 28%. Their CEO, Gerald Finney, who had indeed received a personal call from Lawrence Maxwell, was in full-blown panic mode. Peterson was fired before he even had time to find a lawyer, his termination effective immediately, for conduct detrimental to the company's reputation and shareholder value. But Lawrence Maxwell wasn't done. Ethelred Capital had a long memory and an even longer reach. They discovered that Peterson's wife ran a high-end event planning business. A quick review showed that her 3 largest clients were all portfolio companies of Ethelred. Within a week, all 3 clients cancelled their contracts, citing unforeseen budgetary restructuring. The civil lawsuit proceeded, faced with a mountain of evidence, including the video and testimony from other passengers. Peterson's lawyers advised him to settle. The settlement was brutal. A public, written apology to Royce Maxwell, published in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and a substantial 7-figure donation to a charitable foundation, chosen by Royce, that provided legal aid to minority youths who had been falsely accused of crimes. Peterson was ruined. Professionally, he was toxic. Financially, he was crippled by the settlement. Socially, he was a pariah. The $400 headphones he had so arrogantly accused a teenager of stealing had cost him his career, his reputation, and millions of dollars. He had tried to punch down at who he thought was a nobody, and had instead struck the foundations of a skyscraper, bringing the entire structure down upon himself. The days following Flight 715 unfolded in the hushed tranquility of Lawrence Maxwell's estate in upstate New York. It was a world away from the recycled air of a jet cabin or the sterile canyons of Wall Street. Here, ancient oaks blazed in autumn colors, their fiery leaves blanketing the manicured lawns in a carpet of gold and crimson. For Royce, it was a familiar sanctuary, but for the first time, the quiet felt different. It wasn't just peaceful. It was a space to process, to let the coiled anger and shame inside him finally begin to unwind. He and his father fell into a new rhythm, marked by long, silent walks through the woods, and evenings spent not in front of a television, but before a crackling fireplace. The unspoken tension of the event lingered between them. Lawrence's fury, once a directed weapon at the jet bridge, had cooled into a simmering, protective rage. "You'll fly private from now on," he stated one crisp afternoon as they sat by the edge of a glassy, silent lake. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a decree. "I'll have the Gulf Stream ready for you. No more commercial flights. No more dealing with that." Royce stared at the water, watching a single red leaf drift across its surface. This was the response he expected, the fortress being reinforced, the walls built higher. It was an act of love, he knew, but it felt like a sentence. "No," Royce said softly, his voice clear in the still air. Lawrence turned to him, his brow furrowed. "Royce, what you went through was unacceptable. I can protect you from that. Let me." "That's the problem, Dad," Royce said, finally turning to meet his father's gaze. His eyes were clear, holding a depth of weary understanding that belied his 17 years. "You've spent my whole life protecting me, and I'm grateful for it. But your protection is a filter. I don't want to live in your world. Not completely." He saw the confusion on his father's face and pushed on, the words he had held inside for years finally spilling out. "Your world is tailored. People smile at you because you're Lawrence Maxwell. Waiters rush to your table. Doors that are closed to everyone else swing open for you. When people meet me and find out who I am, they change. Their posture changes. Their voice changes. I cease to be Royce, and I become Maxwell's son. It's like being a ghost in my own life." He paused, taking a breath. "That's why I wear the hoodie and fly commercial. I want to know what the real world is like when my last name isn't in the room. I need people to see me. Sometimes, like on that plane, the real world is ugly. It's prejudiced and unfair. But at least it's real. At least the person they're judging is me, not the idea of my father's money." Lawrence was silent. For a long, profound moment, he said nothing. He had spent a lifetime conquering boardrooms, outmaneuvering rivals, and building an empire from sheer force of will. He understood numbers, risk, and power. But here, by a lake, his own son was explaining a world of subtle pains and invisible cages that he had never fully comprehended. He had seen the incident as an attack to be avenged, a problem to be solved with money and power. He hadn't seen it as a symptom of the very world he had tried and failed to shield his son from. "You are stronger than I ever was at your age," Lawrence said at last, his voice thick with a raw, unfamiliar emotion. The words felt heavy, pulled from a place of deep revelation. "And you have shown me a rot in my own house, I've been sitting in my office on the 80th floor, looking at spreadsheets that represent thousands of employees, and I've forgotten that they are people. Ascend Air is more than an asset on a balance sheet. It's a culture, and I have failed. I have allowed this poison to fester. That conversation by the lake was not an end, but a beginning. The fire was rekindled in Lawrence Maxwell's eyes, but it was no longer just the fire of a vengeful father. It was the focused, cold-burning fire of a builder who had discovered a fatal flaw in his foundation. He wasn't just going to patch the crack. He was going to tear the whole thing down and rebuild it on bedrock. The next morning, he made a call to David Chen. "Cancel my schedule for the next quarter," he commanded. "We're starting a new project. It's called the Maxwell Initiative. Our first target is Ascend Air." The initiative was Lawrence Maxwell's corporate blitzkrieg. He personally diverted $50 million of his own fortune to fund it, a sum that made the entire industry's collective jaws drop. He then sought out the most respected and most feared DEI expert in the country, Dr. Anika Sharma, a sharp, uncompromising academic and activist who had a reputation for shredding corporate hypocrisy. Dr. Sharma was skeptical at their first meeting. "Mr. Maxwell," she said, her arms crossed, "I don't do window dressing. I'm not here to help you write a pretty press release so you can feel better." "Dr. Sharma," Lawrence replied, leaning forward, his intensity filling the cavernous office, "I am not interested in a press release. I'm interested in a cultural exorcism. You will have unlimited budget, unconditional access to every employee from the baggage handlers to the board of directors, and the absolute authority to recommend and implement any change you see fit. Your findings will be my commands. I want you to burn out the rot. Is that clear enough?" She saw in his eyes not the calculated charm of a PR-conscious CEO, but the zealous conviction of a convert. She accepted. What followed was a revolution. The old, condescending training videos were replaced with an immersive, mandatory program built around hyper-realistic VR scenarios. New flight attendants didn't just listen to lectures, they were placed in a virtual cabin and had to face the digital ghost of Chad Peterson, the judgmental glare of Karen Miller, and the quiet dignity of a boy who looked just like Royce. They had to make choices in real time and face the immediate, branching consequences of their biases. The hiring process was torn apart and rebuilt. A new, independent, passenger advocacy office was created, a department with the power to investigate any complaint and whose findings were delivered, unedited, directly to Lawrence's desk. It was an unprecedented system of accountability. Royce, initially reluctant to be the poster boy for the initiative, found he couldn't stay on the sidelines. His father asked him to chair a new youth advisory council, a group of young, frequent flyers from diverse backgrounds who would review the new policies. At the first meeting, when a slick marketing executive presented a watered-down, corporate-friendly version of the new training, Royce spoke up. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm, stopping the presentation cold. "It has to be uglier than that. It has to feel real. You need to show the passengers humiliation. You need to make the employee feel the shame of being wrong. Don't soften it. Don't make it comfortable." His raw honesty set the tone for the entire initiative. He also took personal charge of the foundation funded by Chad Peterson's massive settlement. He named it the Second Look Foundation and began working with its legal team, reading the cases of young people who had been wronged by snap judgments. He met a teenage girl who was expelled for having ibuprofen in her backpack because school officials assumed she was a dealer. He met a boy who was arrested for loitering while waiting for his mother to get off her shift as a cleaner. In their stories, he saw the echo of his own, and his purpose solidified. The legend of Flight 715 became an industry fable, a modern-day epic of corporate karma. The changes at Ascend Air were seismic, creating ripples that forced other airlines to re-examine their own cultures. 2 years later, Ascend Air's customer satisfaction and employee morale scores were the highest in the industry. The Maxwell Initiative became a Harvard Business School case study on how to turn a corporate crisis into a profound and profitable transformation. The humiliation Royce Maxwell suffered at 30,000 feet, a moment of intense personal pain, had become an inflection point, not just for a company, but for a father and a son. It had taught a powerful man the limits of his protection, and had shown a young man the true meaning of his own strength, proving that the deepest change often begins not with a shout, but with the quiet, unwavering demand to be seen for who you truly are. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a mistaken accusation over a pair of headphones. It was a story about the hidden biases that shape our snap judgments and the catastrophic consequences they can have. It's a testament to the fact that true power isn't about yelling the loudest, but about having the strength to remain calm in the face of injustice, knowing that accountability will come. Royce Maxwell's ordeal on Flight 715 became a catalyst, transforming a moment of personal humiliation into a movement of systemic change that reformed an entire corporation. It's a harsh but necessary reminder that character is not defined by wealth or status, but by how we treat those we believe have nothing to offer us. If this story resonated with you, and you believe that accountability matters, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next story. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of authority, big or small, and what happened? Let's talk about it. Thank you for listening.